Combat in D&D should be exciting. It should be, in most cases, the highlight of the session. It's when the stakes are high, tensions rise, and the players are putting everything on the line to save themselves and each other and get through to the end of a terrifying encounter with some dreadful monster like a red dragon or an ancient undead warlord. This should be thrilling. But early on, you will realize as a new DM, it's not always the case. It's not always that fun. Often combat is where the energy drops. It's where things start to slow down, players start pulling out their phones. You can feel the magic ebbing away. Now in this video, I'm going to give you 5 tips that I've implemented over the last few years to really take my combat from something which I almost started to dread to something which is, in my opinion, probably my biggest strength as a DM. I want to make clear that none of these tips are for overhauling the combat system or radically changing the mechanics or introducing new mechanics. These are tips for slight alterations in your DMing style, which I think can help to keep the energy up, keep the combat moving, and avoid that awful feeling of wading through treacle that you can kind of get once you're into the 5th or 6th round of combat and everyone is starting to wonder when this is going to be over. But before we go further, I'm very excited to say that this video is sponsored by Confused Clerics and their new Kickstarter, Elodine's Item and Spell Cards. Confused Clerics are a small group of D&D creators based in Germany, and they want to put out 2 decks, one of homebrew item cards and one of homebrew spell cards. The decks will both be available physically and digitally. Now the cards are illustrated with some stunning pieces of artwork by artists in the community, and the D&D community is a big part of this project. Confused Clerics have for a long time wanted to do this thing, and they've wanted to work with a wide variety of artists who they collaborate with regularly and whose work they're bringing together in this piece. Elodine's item and spell cards come with a bunch of different stretch goals. Confused Clerics want to put out a compendium of spells and items. They want to do custom cards, a whole lot of cool stuff. I'm personally very excited to see how the project progresses. Obviously this is a paid promotion, but by the time this video goes live, I will have already gone over to the Kickstarter myself and backed it, because I really want to see this thing become a reality, and I really want the item cards specifically, both the physical and the digital format, because I play a lot of games online, and I'd love to be able to reward my players with cool digital item cards at the end of a quest. Anyway, a huge thank you to Confused Clerics for being my first sponsor on this channel, and there's a link to their Kickstarter in the description of this video if you want to check it out. Now let's talk about those 5 tips for improving your D&D combat experience. Tip number 1 is design a good turn order. Now obviously initiative is a big fun part of the game, and players love to roll initiative, so don't take that away from them. But if you have a lot of enemies on the map, I would recommend that you don't roll initiative randomly for those enemies. Instead, structure the turn order as much as possible for the players to have a better experience. Let's say I have a big boss and the boss has 5 or 6 minions. Now I'll roll initiative for the boss, but I probably won't roll it for the minions. I'll clatter some dice behind my DM screen, but then I'll put the minions into the best possible turn order for the maximum fun we can have in the session. What I'm trying to do is make sure that the players never have to go too long before someone in the party can have a turn. Players, even if they're not up themselves, can get excited about each other's turn, but if they have to sit through 4 or 5 enemies in a row, each taking individual turns, they start to switch off, they start to get a bit distracted. It also works the other way. Remember, players don't want the fight to be over like that. They do want a bit of a challenge. But if all the players end up getting their turns before the main enemy, say it's even just one big boss and all the players go first, by the time the big boss's turn comes around, he could be down to half health depending on how well the players rolled. So sometimes I will structure it so the boss appears a little bit higher up in the turn order, just to make sure that the fight doesn't feel too easy. Tip number 2, and this is where we get to the really important stuff, is don't let turn order dictate when you narrate the combat. So narration throughout the combat is going to keep things interesting. You're going to keep telling your players what's going on, what the different enemies are doing, what kind of effects are taking place in the battle, what they're sensing, their smell, their sight, their hearing. That doesn't have to be limited to when you're up controlling an enemy. At the end of a player's turn, you can just tell them cool stuff that's going on, and it won't necessarily have a mechanical impact, but it would just keep them in the game. For example, if I see a player whose turn isn't for another, maybe it's almost a full round before they're coming around again, they're a little bit bored, I can see they're tuning out slightly, I would tell them that, oh, by the way, that hobgoblin archer just turned towards you, and you can see he's leveling a bow, he's getting ready to fire at you. Now, at the end of the day, I'm not actually readying an action for the hobgoblin. The hobgoblin's turn also isn't coming for a little while, but I'm just letting that player know that they are still on the map, the enemies are still aware of them, and it jogs their mind, it makes them start thinking and planning ahead to their turn. The goal here is just to keep bringing the players back into the sense that this is all happening right now, and that just because it's not their turn doesn't mean that they're not on the battlefield with skin in the game. Narrating cool stuff outside of the official initiative order is also a good way to keep the players moving a little bit faster than they might otherwise. One big thing that you can't really control is how fast players take their turns. And while some DMs advocate for quite a forceful approach, where if someone takes too long, you just skip them and you go to the next person, I really don't like doing that. I play with relatively small groups. I want everyone to get their turn and have their moment in the sunshine, even if they're maybe a little bit slow, off the bat on their turn. What I like to do instead is, if a player is taking a little bit too long on their turn, I tell them that some stuff is happening around them on the battlefield. Now, this stuff won't actually be super impactful, but it would just put a little bit of tension on them without it just being me rushing them along. So, for example, I'll tell them that while they are procrastinating, an enemy nearby has maybe pulled out a health potion and looks like they're about to regenerate some of their own health. They don't even need to do it at that moment, but I'm just saying, hey, stuff is going on around you. It's almost like everything's moving in slow motion, but it is still moving. I may even, if we're getting to an extreme point, I might have something move around them. So I might say, okay, that enemy that's off in the distance, they've actually just moved forward 5 feet. Now, it's only 5 feet. It doesn't actually bring them into contact with the players, but in the player's mind, they're thinking, okay, this isn't on pause, we are still moving, I need to think a little bit faster. And again, it's not quite as intense as just skipping their turn. Tip number 3 is enemy variety. Now, it might feel right in the lore of your world to have a whole band of goblins going into battle, or a whole band of orcs. But if they're all just essentially the same stat block, like a bunch of clones going in, it's not going to be that fun. Very quickly, the players will start picking up on what attacks the orcs have. They'll begin to realise that they all have the same AC, and that sense of fighting a varied roster of villains begins to fade away. I would always recommend, where possible, having a couple of different, at least variants on orcs, or variants on whatever the enemy is. For example, that's why I love hobgoblins. I always bring them up in my videos. But in the lore, they often bring along wild animals that they've tamed. So, for example, in a recent combat encounter, my players were fighting the hobgoblins. Halfway through, a big armoured owlbear bursts out of the camp behind them and attacks the players. The players thought they were fighting hobgoblins. Suddenly, they're fighting a giant, angry, armoured owlbear. So that's what I'm talking about. Just bring in other monsters throughout the fight at different intervals throughout the fight, so it never feels like just the same repeating patterns. Again, this is where minions come in. And one of the cool things with minions is you can use quite low energy minions that only have maybe 1 HP. So it's going to take a single attack of anyone, one unarmed strike, and these minions are gone. But they deal full damage. So the players still feel a little bit anxious as the minions close in around them, but then they get the satisfaction of cutting them down right, left and centre. And that can be great as well in a long combat encounter if people start getting these little kills early on. Sure, it's just an imp that flew down with 1 HP and they cut it out of the air. Maybe the big boss is still, an hour's fight away, but they're going to start feeling good about themselves because they managed to take out a few of the minions. I like to lower monster HP a little bit, and by a proportionate amount increase the damage output. So usually by about 25% each way, I'll bring a monster's HP down so they die faster essentially, but I'll make sure that while they're dying faster, they're dealing more damage. Because I always think that you get the best of both worlds there. You're getting the players feeling this kind of rising tension because they're taking a lot of damage, but it doesn't drag on to the point where the players are just hacking away and the monster is still there, and it doesn't feel unfair because sure, the monster's hitting a lot harder, but maybe it takes a quarter or a third less the time than it would have otherwise. Over time, your players are going to start to deal extremely heavy damage, and at that point, sure, you want monsters to have a lot of HP because the players are going to be taking a lot of HP. But in that sort of sweet spot from maybe like level 3 up to even level 8 or 9, I think a really good rule is to always make your bosses a little bit lower in health and a little bit more dangerous. If you're not completely comfortable with that, you can take the bloodied approach, which was in 4th edition, I believe, and have a halfway point where when the monster's health hits a certain point, that's when they suddenly get their increased attacks. I mean, that's a good rule at any time because it gives that players a sense of mounting tension, but I would recommend going in from the start and saying it's a weaker monster in terms of its health, but it's a more dangerous monster. On the subject of bloodied, that idea that when you get to the halfway point on health, the monster becomes more dangerous, I really recommend you do that as well. This isn't one of the tips, but I've been doing it a lot recently, and it's so much fun. I even like to create some additional abilities that only really come online when the monster gets to that halfway point, because the players can almost get this sense that yes, they're backing the monster into a corner, but as they're doing that, the monster is becoming more desperate, it's hitting harder, maybe it's kind of going full power as it gets into that final stage of its life. So I would recommend trying that. It's a lot of fun, and especially if you start coming up with some kind of homebrewed ideas for what the monster can do at that bloodied point. Bloodied, for anyone who doesn't know, is just the phrase we use for like that halfway health point. Tip number 5, our final tip, is the one that I think has had the biggest impact on my playstyle and the ability I have now to give my players a genuinely good experience, an ability I just lacked when I started out as a DM. 9 times out of 10, if you have a bad D&D combat encounter, it's an encounter where halfway through everyone just starts saying numbers. Rolling, here's my attack, here's the damage, boom, moving on. There's no flavour to it. There's no sense that any of this is actually happening. It's just like kind of a weird, violent math problem. Now, the goal with this tip is to try and get beyond that, to say, no, this is still a roleplay experience. And the simplest way to do this, ask questions. This applies to all parts of D&D, but especially combat. When players do stuff, say, what does that look like? How are you doing that? What does the monster see as you bring that blade down towards them? Asking those little questions keeps it in the player's head that this is still a fantasy story that they are telling. They get to describe the cool stuff they're doing. And suddenly, it's not just 15 damage and the monster goes down. It's 15 damage and the player leaps up into the air, springboarding off the crumbling ruined statue, brings their blade down, beheads the monster, blood sprays up in the air. The players are going to be so into that because they're telling the story, you're maybe augmenting it with little details about how the monster is twitching on the ground. That stuff is really good, that's gold, and that is what makes players stay invested right the way through long combat encounters. Anyway folks, that is the video. I just wanted to skim through those points and give you some advice for just changing up your approach, your style when it comes to running combat encounters. Almost looking beyond the mechanics to just you as a DM, how you interact with the players, because that is really what's going to define whether they have a great experience or a long, mediocre experience. Again, a huge thank you to Confused Clerics for sponsoring the video and for letting me talk about their Kickstarter, which I'm genuinely very excited about. Again, there is a link to their Kickstarter in the description on this video, and the Eladin's item and spell cards are going to be, I think, quite an exciting addition to my own games, and I'm really excited to see how the project progresses. Also, a huge thank you to my patrons who, of course, they sponsor every video, they sponsor everything I do here, and I'm really excited about some of the content I have lined up for them. And just a huge thank you to everyone who's supported me through the rebranding process. I'm very excited about Tales Arcane and everything we're going to do as Tales Arcane. And it's just been so nice to see that everyone's on board with the direction I'm going in. Anyway, thank you for watching. I'll see you next time.